Hello, traveler of the night. My name is Milo, and tonight I am here gently beside you. Not to teach, not to fix, but simply to accompany you. As a long day finally comes to a close. Have you ever wondered why certain desires intoxicate us to the point of blindness? Why images that feel like love slowly turn into illusions that drain us of our strength? In the inner world of every man, Carl Jung called this Anima, the unconscious feminine archetype, the source of inspiration, intuition, and emotional depth. But when the anima becomes distorted, it no longer guides. It begins to deceive. This video was created for that very moment. The moment you realize you are pursuing something with great intensity, a person, a dream, an ideal. Yet the closer you get, the emptier you feel. Together, we will look directly at desire, fantasy, and illusion, not to judge, but to understand what within you is longing to be seen. This is not a dry psychology lecture. This is a slow journey, deep enough to touch the most delicate layers of the unconscious, and gentle enough for you to relax, to listen, and then to rest. If you have ever fallen in love with a figure born of imagination, if you have ever lost yourself in your own longing, stay. Perhaps tonight you will understand why. Let yourself relax. Let yourself listen. And allow the anima to speak. As you gradually drift into sleep, you are enough, and you have always been enough. Part 1. The Threshold of Shadows. We begin at a very fragile moment, a moment when consciousness no longer stands upright, but tilts like a candle about to go out in a darkened room. This is neither the time of day nor of complete dreaming, but a threshold, a place where images no longer obey familiar logic, and emotions that have never been named begin to rise. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." It is precisely within this hazy region that we encounter the parts of ourselves that have been forgotten. Imagine that you are standing before a dark crimson ocean, not the color of outward violence, but the color of primordial life energy, moving chaotically within the unconscious. Jung did not see the unconscious as a peaceful place, but as a living world filled with contradiction and transformation. The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. That ocean is both frightening and necessary. It is where all archetypal images are conceived, and also where they can become distorted. Tonight, we do not enter this journey through logos, sharp reason analysis, division naming. Logos is useful in daylight, but at night it becomes coarse. Jung warned that approaching the unconscious through reason alone can render a person rigid and disconnected from inner life. Instead, we listen through eros, through feeling, through connection, through the capacity to allow what is unclear to exist. Where love reigns, there is no will to power. And where power predominates, love is lacking. It is at this very threshold that the Anima appears. No longer the gentle muse of intuition and creativity, but misaligned figures, alluring yet destabilizing. When the Anima is not properly recognized, she no longer serves as a bridge into depth, but becomes a mirror reflecting immature desires. Jung wrote, "Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. And when that image is overtaken by fantasy, it begins whispering promises that are never fulfilled." Perhaps you have lived this experience, loving an image more than a person, pursuing a feeling more than truth. A distorted anima does not destroy through violence, but through illusion. It convinces one that happiness exists somewhere outside, in a face, a dream, an ideal. Yet the closer one gets, the deeper the emptiness grows. Jung described this state as an unconscious possession. The anima is a personification of the unconscious. When unseen, it governs from the shadows. Do not rush to fear the figures appearing tonight. They do not arrive to punish, but to be heard. Jung believed that every psychological symptom carries symbolic meaning. A neurosis is the avoidance of legitimate suffering. Illusions, distorted longings, recurring obsessions, all are the language of the unconscious, attempting to speak what daylight consciousness has not dared to hear. Allow this voice to slow you down. There is no need to understand immediately, no need to explain. Simply allow the images to appear and then dissolve like waves upon that dark crimson sea. In Jungian psychology, healing does not come from eliminating darkness, but from establishing a relationship with it. What you resist persists, and what is seen with courage gradually loses its power. This is why this video is not designed to activate or inspire in a loud or forceful way. It is a safe space where you may sit at the threshold of your own inner world and listen to whispers long ignored. When the anima is distorted, what is required is not rejection, but discernment to distinguish between the call of life and the illusion born of lack. If you allow yourself to remain here long enough tonight, not to defeat the shadows, but to recognize them, something very different will begin to happen. The figures that once felt terrifying will slowly lose their authority, and then the anima, no longer an illusion, may gradually return to her original role, a silent guide into depth where life is reborn in stillness. Part 2. The hunger of the soulless. And when you have stood long enough at the threshold of those specters, where the anima is no longer a clear guide, but an obsessive whisper, another sensation begins to emerge. No longer fear, no longer curiosity, but hunger. A hunger that does not belong to the body, nor entirely to sexuality. It is the hunger of a soul that has lost its connection to itself. Carl Jung once wrote a line that is cold, yet painfully true. Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. When a man loses the ability to connect with his inner world, he does not merely become lonely, he becomes empty. And that emptiness does not remain still. It demands. It presses. It hungers. Have you ever wondered why a man can become intoxicated by a woman who is a complete stranger so deeply that he is willing to trade everything he has built: family, reputation, stability, all collapsing because of a glance, a voice, a feeling of as if we have known each other in another life? This is not love. This is desire, distorted by a misaligned anima. In Jungian psychology, the anima is not the actual woman in the outer world, but the feminine image within a man, the place where intuition, emotion, the capacity to love and depth of soul reside. Jung stated this very clearly. Every man carries within him the image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definite feminine image. When this image is not made conscious, it does not disappear. It is projected. And that is where tragedy begins. The man does not love the woman herself. He loves the hook the invisible hook that his anima has hung upon her. She becomes a surface for his starving soul to cling to. All the qualities he has lost within tenderness, meaning vitality, the feeling of being himself, are assigned to her. Jung called this a form of unconscious possession. Projection is one of the commonest psychic phenomena. This infatuation can be overwhelming. It carries the color of destiny, fate, true love. But beneath it all, it is no different from an addiction, a desperate attempt to recover the soul outside oneself. Jung warned neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Rather than facing the pain of inner emptiness, one tries to fill it with desire. The deepest pain does not lie in betrayal or outward collapse. The true pain is this: no one is truly loved. The woman is reduced to a symbol. The man is reduced to a starving seeker. And the soul, the very thing that needed to be heard, is once again abandoned. Jung described this state as a profound estrangement from oneself. The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Instead of turning inward, one runs outward. Perhaps you are listening to this story with a different resonance. Perhaps you have been the woman onto whom projections were cast. Perhaps you have felt the gaze of a man who did not see you as a human being, but as a promise of salvation. At first, that feeling can be intoxicating, but very quickly it becomes heavy because no one can carry another person's soul. In the process of individuation, Jung emphasized that the anima must be recognized within, not sought outside. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. When desire takes the lead, it disguises itself as destiny. When illuminated, it returns to its rightful place, a signal that something inside is missing. Tonight, we do not condemn desire. Desire itself is not evil. It is life energy. But when severed from the soul, it becomes aggressive, possessive, and addictive. Jung wrote, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling. When feeling and meaning are split apart, desire tries to mend the fracture in the most brutal way. Let this story touch you, not to reopen wounds, but to ask the right question again. What does this hunger truly need? Not another person, not an illusion, but a return, a slow reconnection with the inner feminine, where the soul was once neglected. If you feel a heaviness while listening that is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that truth is being touched. Jung believed that every crisis carries within it the seed of transformation. In all chaos, there is a cosmos; in all disorder, a secret order. The hunger of the soulless is not a condemnation. It is an invitation. And from this very pain, if you remain here long enough, we will descend into a deeper layer, where desire no longer rules as a tyrant, but becomes a doorway into understanding. But before that can happen, the soul must be seen, not hurried, not avoided, only listened to. Part 3. Maya and the veil that conceals. Truth, and when the hunger of the soul has been named, when desire is no longer seen as a sin, but as a signal of absence, something essential must take place. Soothing, not through justification, and certainly not through denying pain, but through a deeper gaze, one in which philosophy becomes a dim, warm light, gentle enough that we no longer tremble before what has happened. In the later years of his life, Carl Jung increasingly turned toward Eastern philosophy. He recognized that certain truths of the unconscious cannot be reached through analysis alone, but must be seen as structured illusion. It is precisely here that the image of Maya appears, the goddess of illusion, the veil that conceals ultimate reality. Jung did not use this concept casually. He wrote, "The world is not what it appears to be, and neither are we." In a misaligned anima state, a man does not merely project, he is drawn into a dance of illusion. Maya does not lie crudely. She seduces. She whispers. She makes fantasies feel more vivid than reality itself. Within this cocoon, the man no longer sees the woman as a real human being, nor does he see himself. Everything becomes symbolic. Jung described this as a state of possession by the archetype. The archetype is not an inherited idea, but an inherited possibility of ideas. What this philosophy offers, and what brings the deepest comfort to the one left behind, is the understanding that what happened was not a betrayal of your worth. It is not proof that you were not enough, not worthy, or that you did something wrong. It is a sign that the other person lost their way in the labyrinth of the unconscious, where Maya held the reins. Jung once wrote with striking clarity, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls." When the soul has not been confronted, Maya assumes a substitute role. She constructs beautiful stories and intoxicating promises so that one does not have to return to the inner void. Seen in this light, harmful behavior is no longer understood as malice, but as profound disorientation. This understanding is not meant to excuse blindly. Jung did not advocate endurance at the cost of one's boundaries, nor the denial of personal limits. But he emphasized that prolonged resentment is itself a form of bondage of the soul. Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies. When you understand that the other is being driven by a force larger than their ego, you can begin to withdraw the energy that was hooked into that illusion. This is a very subtle moment of transformation. It is not they were right, nor is it you were wrong. It is this was a drama of archetypes, and both were caught in their roles. Jung believed that only when we recognize ourselves inside a symbol can we step out of it. Freedom is not achieved by suppressing one's emotions, but by understanding them. In Eastern philosophy, Maya is not an enemy. She is the one who veils, and also the one who teaches. When the veil remains intact, we believe the illusion. When it trembles slightly, we begin to doubt. And when it is seen for what it truly is, it loses its power. Jung wrote, "Illusions are common, and we live by them. But the illusion must be recognized as such. Recognition, that is the key." In the safe space of tonight, this philosophy does not arrive to justify pain, but to free you from carrying that pain as a personal sentence. When resentment dissolves, it is not because the other deserves forgiveness, but because your soul deserves lightness. Understanding becomes a profound act of self-protection. Allow the image of Maya to appear, and then to dissolve. There is no need to argue with her, no need to drive her away. Simply see. Jung believed the unconscious does not need to be defeated. It needs to be entered into dialogue. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. This encounter, painful as it may be, still carries within it a seed of awakening. And when insight replaces resentment, a new space opens, a space where you are no longer trapped in the question, "Why did they do this to me?" but begin to touch a deeper, quieter question. What within me needs to return? But before entering that question, the soul must rest in the understanding that this was not a failure of worth, but a lesson of illusion. And from the very moment Maya loosens her veil, we will move one step further into a place where the Anima no longer seduces through fantasy, but begins to reveal her true nature. That, however, we will leave for the next part. Part 4. The gray smoke in the forest of memory. And when Maya's veil has been seen for what it truly is, no longer an accusation, and no longer a justification, a very different kind of stillness begins to spread. Resentment does not need to be chased away. It withdraws on its own when there is no ground left for it to cling to. In that quiet space, the mind no longer tries to understand, but allows. It is precisely this moment of allowing that opens the next doorway, where reason gently steps back, and the unconscious begins to speak in the language of images. Now let your breath slow down, longer, softer, as if each breath were a light step leading you deeper into an ancient forest. Mist hangs low, light diffuses into gentle gray streaks. This is not the forest of the present, but the forest of deep memory, where time does not move in a straight line, but coils back upon itself. Carl Jung once wrote, "The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual." In this forest, that heritage is whispering. Here, the Anima no longer takes the form of a womanhood meant to seduce or guide. She dissolves, becoming gray, smoke, subtle, elusive, impossible to grasp. When the image dissolves, the power of the image dissolves with it. Jung reminds us that the unconscious does not need to be held. It needs to be experienced. The unconscious is not a thing, but a process. And that process now is passing through you like mist gliding across skin. Feel that smoke brushing against you, cool, weightless. It does not demand. It does not promise. It simply is. In this space, there is no right or wrong, no winning or losing. The rigid divisions of daytime have softened. Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." But when pain has been named and understood, it no longer needs to speak. Now the body is permitted to rest. Ancestral impressions begin to drift through, not as personal memories, but as wordless fragments of film, distant footsteps, the scent of damp earth, flickering firelight in a stone cave, the slow drumbeat of a ritual whose name has been forgotten. Jung called these archetypal memories forms of experience that are inherited, not learned. In each of us, there is another whom we do not know. This forest is where that other passes by. You do not need to follow each image. Let them come and let them go. The unconscious does not need to be controlled. It needs to be trusted. The psyche is a self-regulating system. When it is no longer forced to make sense, it adjusts itself. In the gray smoke, the boundary between memory and imagination becomes faint. And it is precisely this faintness that brings a feeling of lightness. Perhaps you notice that you are drifting, not falling. Drifting gently among layers of meaning that are old among stories that once hurt and now lose their sharp edges. Jung believed that the deepest healing does not occur through interpretation, but through symbolic experience. Symbols are the natural language of the psyche. The smoke is such a symbol, not to be held, not to be resisted, only allowed. In this forest of memory, the Anima has released her role as a guide with form. She becomes atmosphere, that which surrounds, supports, and permits. When the Anima is returned to her true nature, she no longer manipulates through fantasy, but expands perception. Jung wrote, "Feeling is not opposed to thinking it is a different function. Here feeling leads without words. If something rises a trace of sadness, a vague longing, let it drift with the mist. No need to name it, no need to conclude. What you resist persists, and what is allowed will dissolve on its own." The gray smoke carries no command. It carries permission to rest. Let the breath continue its work. With each exhale, you may release a little more, a judgment, a story, a role. In this space, the ego does not need to prove anything. Jung emphasized, the ego is not the center of the psyche. When the center steps aside, the natural flow finds its rhythm again. Gradually, the forest no longer feels foreign. It becomes familiar, like a place you once inhabited, long before language existed. This is relaxation into the unconscious in its deepest sense, not sinking, not disappearing, but being held. What needs to be remembered will remain. What has completed its task will dissolve with the mist. And when you have drifted long enough within that gray smoke, something subtle occurs, a sense of ease that needs no reason. Not because every question has been answered, but because the questions are no longer urgent. Jung wrote, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct. In the gentle play of mist and breath, something new begins to form quietly. From this forest of memory, when the breath has steadied and the body has grown calm, we will move into another layer where union is no longer an idea, but a soft sense of wholeness. But before going on, remain here a little longer. The night is still long, and the unconscious, when trusted, will continue to lull you into deeper rest. Part 5. When the soul becomes a vampire. And when you have drifted long enough within the gray smoke of the forest of memory, when the boundary between memory and imagination has grown faint, something else begins to take shape. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, like a chill seeping into the bones. This is the moment when the unconscious reveals the destructive face of misalignment, where the anima is no longer a supportive mist, but becomes a hunger that drains life force. There are times when the anima becomes so distorted that she takes on the form of a vampire, not in a mythical sense, but in a precise psychological one. She does not kill with fangs. She siphons vitality through passivity, resentment, and cutting remarks that seem to come from nowhere. The man at this point no longer stands firmly in a mature ego. He regresses, becoming as helpless as an abandoned child, demanding to be soothed, while simultaneously punishing the nearest person for the emptiness within himself. Carl Jung once wrote, "When an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. When the anima is not recognized and integrated, she does not disappear. She possesses. And when possessed, a man no longer acts from meaning, but reacts from unconscious hunger. Every sarcastic remark, every sulking silence, every act of sabotaging joy, all are symptoms, not essence. The pain here is sharp precisely because it is not loud like betrayal, nor clear-cut like separation. It corrodes. Life is drained away drop by drop. Mornings grow heavy. Even small decisions carry doubt. The one who was once strong gradually becomes someone who constantly negates himself. Jung described this state with a brief, chilling line. Depression is like a woman in black. When the anima becomes vampiric, she drapes that black garment over the whole of life. Perhaps you have witnessed this at close range. A man who was once creative, once driven by aspiration, suddenly becomes passive and bitter. He does not destroy through grand acts, but by draining meaning from everything. Nothing is ever good enough. No choice can be trusted. Every joy is questioned. Jung warned, the loss of soul means the loss of meaning. And when meaning is drained away, the soul begins to seek nourishment elsewhere, often by feeding on those nearby. This does not mean that you must carry that burden. Understanding is not endurance. Jung drew a clear distinction between insight and self-sacrifice. But to step out of that draining orbit, the mechanism must first be seen. The vampiric anima does not ask for love. She demands energy. And that energy is taken by making others feel smaller, uncertain, and exhausted. Jung wrote, people who are not in touch with their own depths will always try to fill the emptiness from the outside. When depth is neglected, the surface becomes a battlefield. This destruction does not arise from a deliberate malice. It arises from hunger that has not been named. Understanding this does not immediately ease the pain, but it opens the possibility of withdrawing the energy that has been siphoned away. Notice something subtle. A vampire cannot survive light, not the light of judgment, but the light of awareness. When this phenomenon is named accurately, it begins to lose its power. Jung said, to confront a person with his shadow is to show him his own light. When passivity and bitterness are seen as expressions of a misaligned anima, they no longer serve as a verdict on your worth. In the rhythm of tonight, we do not rekindle anger. We place pain within its proper symbolic context. The vampiric anima is a sign that life energy has become locked inside the man. It signals that the soul must be returned to its center, not continue feeding from the outside. Jung emphasized, the psyche is a self-regulating system. When it is seen, it seeks its own correction. If fatigue rises within you, allow it to be there. No need to push it away. No need to interpret it. In this safe space, pain is set down, not exploited. With each exhale, a strand of entangled energy is released. A vampire survives through attachment. When attachment dissolves, it withdraws on its own. Remember, the purpose of this part is not to conclude that that man is a failure. Jung did not label people. He described states. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. A state can change when awareness returns. And you, in this moment, need only do one deeply Jungian thing: hold your inner boundaries so that your life force is no longer drained. In the quiet, after that chill, something else is preparing to emerge. When the anima no longer drains, when energy is returned, a new kind of emptiness opens, not a void, but a space for restructuring. But before we move, there remain a little longer with the breath. The night is still doing its work, gathering the fragments of life force that were once scattered. And from the very moment destruction is seen without being identified with, we will move into the next part, where energy is transformed and the soul learns how to nourish itself. But let that arrive only when the body is ready. Part 6. Orpheus and the Song of Rebirth. And when destruction has been faced directly without identification, when the image of the vampiric anima no longer drains life force, because the light of awareness has reached it, a very different kind of stillness emerges. Not the emptiness of despair, but the quiet after a storm, where the soul, though exhausted, is still alive. It is within this stillness that philosophy ceases to be an explanation and becomes a song of consolation, guiding one through pain rather than trapping them inside it. Carl Jung once wrote a sentence that unsettles many, yet holds the key to maturity. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Consciousness is not born of safety, but of collision. And when a misaligned anima pulls a person to the edge of self-destruction, when she becomes what Jung called a death demon, this is not a final curse. It is an invitation to descend. Here the myth of Orpheus enters as a healing image. Orpheus is not a hero who triumphs through strength. He descends into the underworld not to conquer, but to confront. With his lyre, with his full presence, he enters the deepest realm of loss. Jung regarded such myths as maps of the collective unconscious. Myth is the natural and indispensable intermediate stage between unconscious and conscious cognition. Orpheus symbolizes the ego that dares to descend into the unconscious in order to bring something back. Jungian philosophy does not teach us to avoid the pain caused by a misaligned anima. On the contrary, it states clearly, if we do not descend willingly, we will be dragged down. What you resist persists. The inner storms, depression, destruction, loss of meaning are not punishments. They are master trials, forcing a man to stop projecting and begin reclaiming the soul to its center. Jung emphasized that every profound crisis is generative in nature. In all chaos, there is a cosmos in all disorder, a secret order. When the Anima draws a man into darkness, she does not merely destroy. She demands maturity. He can no longer live on illusions, emotional hooks, or the extraction of energy from outside himself. He is compelled to ask, which part of me has been neglected? At this stage, pain is no longer meaningless. It becomes an alchemical furnace. Jung often used alchemical imagery to describe the process of individuation. The alchemical process is a symbolic description of the individuation process. In this furnace, heavy states the lead of mood despair, self-doubt, are not discarded, but melted down. Without fire, there is no transformation. Orpheus fails when he turns back to look at Eurydice. Jung did not read this failure as a moral flaw, but as a reminder. The soul cannot be brought back through the ego's impatience. New consciousness must be born in its proper rhythm. The ego cannot be the master in its own house. When a man learns not to force healing, the Anima begins to change her form. At this stage, the Anima is no longer the demon of death. She becomes the guide of rebirth. No longer seducing through fantasy, no longer draining through passivity, she demands inner honesty. Jung wrote, "The Anima is the guide or mediator to the unconscious. When integrated, she leads one out of the underworld, not back to what was before, but back more deeply." This philosophy soothes because it restores meaning to pain. What happened is no longer a senseless mistake, but a necessary turning point. The man was not destroyed by a misaligned anima. He was forced to grow up. Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health. Jung did not romanticize suffering, but he affirmed that avoiding it causes the soul to wither. In the rhythm of tonight, we do not demand immediate change. Rebirth does not occur through determination, but through conscious endurance. Let Orpheus's song unfold slowly, not to pull someone else back, but to reform oneself. Each pain fully felt is a layer of lead being dissolved. You may notice something very quiet when pain is placed within its proper Jungian context. It no longer threatens. It becomes the language of the process. Jung wrote, "The soul has a natural tendency toward healing. There is no need to push, no need to fix, only not to turn away." And it is here that Orpheus's song completes its task, not through a dramatic victory, but through the quiet return of vitality. The Anima, restored to her role as mediator, ceases to pull one downward. She begins to lift gently from within. From this rebirth, something very subtle awaits ahead, where energy no longer needs to struggle, but begins to unify. But before moving on, let the soul rest in the resonance of that song. The night is still long enough for the process to complete in its own rhythm. Part 7. The Song of the Sirens, under moonlight. And when Orpheus's song has soothed the final vibrations of pain, when life force has returned to its center and no longer needs to strain simply to survive, consciousness gently recedes like a shoreline after the tide. There is no longer a need to understand more, no urge to reach conclusions, only a still surface opening before you, a place where the unconscious no longer demands, but invites. Allow yourself to sink into that lake. The water is so calm, it reflects both the moonlight and images not yet formed into words. In this space, the sirens and Lorelei begin to sing. But this is not the seductive song of danger. It is the melody of dreams, taking shape of meanings still tender, not yet needing names. Jung once wrote, "The dream is the small hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul." This song does not pull you away. It opens a door. You are no longer standing on the shore. You are drifting, not drowning, not being carried off, simply drifting as if the body has remembered an ancient skill. In the moonlight, you see yourself transform into an owl, the symbol of wisdom that can see within darkness without trying to banish it. Jung reminded us that deep wisdom is not blinding light, but the capacity to remain with the night. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The owl does not chase away the night. It reads it. From this vantage point, you observe figures gliding beneath the surface of the water. At times, an ugly witch, at times, a radiant goddess. There is no need to choose, no need to classify. Jung called this the dance of archetypes opposing energies, seeking their way back to balance. The archetypes are living forces. When not constrained by the ego, they move softly without conflict. The song of the sirens is therefore no longer a threat. It is a lullaby for the parts that were once torn apart. Each note is an emotion allowed to appear and then dissolve. Jung once said, "Feeling is the main function of consciousness. Here feeling leads the way." There is no need to think, no need to figure out what a symbol means. The symbol does its own work. The owl flies low, close to the water's surface. You see gentle ripples spreading outward, touching memory, then fading away. There is no right or wrong, no lesson that must be extracted. Only harmony, where the witch and the goddess no longer oppose one another, but participate together in a single melody. Jung wrote, "The psyche is a self-regulating system. When trusted, it adjusts itself without command. If at any moment you recognize a familiar image, an old fear, a desire that once caused turmoil, let it drift past like moonlight disturbed by water. What you resist persists, and what is allowed loses its pull. The sirens sing not to hold on. They sing to release. The moonlight softens. The owl settles on a dry branch, listening. Here, wisdom is not an answer, but the capacity for silence." Jung emphasized, "The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct. In the play of images and sound, something new is being seeded very quietly. Beneath the surface, the figures no longer need to take on extreme forms. The witch loses her sharp edges. The goddess dims her glare. Energy finds its middle rhythm. This is the moment when the unconscious performs its work of reconciliation, not through argument, but through dance. Symbols are the natural language of the psyche, and that language is now speaking through music. Let your breath synchronize with the lake. In and out. Not deeper, not slower, just even. Each breath is a permission. In the moonlight, the sirens and Lorelei no longer have clear forms. They dissolve into resonance. When images dissolve, their power dissolves as well. What remains is a sense of safety without reason. The owl gently folds its wings. Wisdom has completed its role to see without interfering. Jung wrote, "The ego is not the master in its own house. When the ego knows how to step back, the house rearranges itself. Dreams not yet formed are lulled to rest, not pressured to become anything. And in that quiet, you may notice a very delicate feeling roundness, Not perfection, but enough. Enough to rest. Enough to trust that the process continues even while consciousness sleeps. The soul has a natural tendency toward healing. There is nothing more you need to do. From this moonlit lake, we will descend into an even deeper layer where the song gradually fades. Images grow dim, and sleep opens its final door. But before moving on, remain here a little longer. The night is soothing, and the unconscious, when listened to, will continue to guide you along the gentlest path. Part 8. The Altar of the Deceased Wife. And when the song of the sirens has dissolved into moonlight, when the images beneath the lake no longer demand to be named, a very different feeling slowly reveals itself. Not loud, not violent, but heavy cold and still, like an altar erected in the center of the soul's chamber. This is a place where romance no longer carries the warmth of life, but the scent of memory preserved in ice. The deepest pain sometimes does not come from betrayal or violence, but from a man worshipping an image that is no longer alive. Jung described this as a particularly dangerous form of anima projection, one in which the feminine image is no longer connected to living reality, but frozen in the past. It may be a dead wife, a former love, or an ideal that was never touched by real life. He loves absence, not presence. Jung wrote with sharp clarity, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When the anima is frozen, the man does not realize that he is living under the command of a ghost. He does not betray the woman beside him in the conventional sense. He is absent, and that absence is wrapped in very beautiful language: loyalty, remembrance, eternal love. But this beauty is destructive. Romanticizing absence turns death, whether literal death or the death of a relationship, into an unreachable standard. A woman of flesh and blood, with human needs, emotions, and limits, cannot compete with a perfect image that no longer has to live. Jung warned of the danger of idealization. The more idealistic the image, the further it is from reality. And when that ideal is placed upon an altar, life is pushed aside. Your burden in this situation does not lie in being not good enough. It lies in the fact that you are being placed into a battle you cannot win. How can one compete with a memory that does not age, does not air, does not change. Jung described this state as possession by an image. An archetype is like an old watercourse along which the water of life has flowed for centuries. When the flow is blocked and frozen, it becomes a swamp. The man in this state often speaks of love in a low, poetic voice. But this is not the poetry of life. It is the poetry of a funeral. This romanticization is a subtle prison. Death is sanctified, while life, with all its messiness, demands, and imperfection, is rejected. Jung wrote, "The acceptance of oneself is the essence of the whole moral problem. And here, what is being rejected is living reality itself." What makes this especially painful is that such romanticization is often praised by society. Loyalty to the deceased, preserving beautiful memories, not betraying the past. But Jungian psychology looks deeper when memory becomes an altar. It is no longer remembrance, it is avoidance. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own souls. Facing life requires more courage than facing death. In this space, the anima is no longer a siren that lulls nor a vampire that drains. She becomes a statue, beautiful, cold, motionless, and that statue demands the silent sacrifice of the living. Jung once said, "Where love reigns, there is no will to power. And where power predominates, love is lacking." When an image of the past holds power present, love has no place to stand. Jungian philosophy does not call for smashing the altar in anger. Anger is still a form of attachment. What is required is the withdrawal of energy from the dead image. Not forgetting, but returning it to its rightful place, a part of history, not the center of life. Jung emphasized this process as a condition of individuation. Individuation means becoming an individual. And insofar as individuality embraces our innermost last and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. If you feel exhausted standing beside such an altar, that feeling is real. It is not selfishness. It is the reflex of life when it is being denied. In the rhythm of tonight, we do not force change. We simply look directly at the mechanism. When the mechanism is named, it gradually loses its spell. Freedom is not achieved by suppressing one's emotions, but by understanding them. Allow the image of the altar to appear and then to recede. No need to shatter it. No need to justify anything. Romanticization survives only when it is not touched by the light of awareness. And that light in Jung is not a blinding glare, but a light sufficient to distinguish the living from the dead. From this moment, as the altar begins to lose its false sacredness, a new space opens, one where life can return without asking permission from the past. But before moving on, let the soul rest a little longer in the truth that has just been touched. The night is still doing its work, separating what has died from what is still alive. Part 9. The Wedding in the Dark Chamber. And when the altar of the dead image gradually loses its power, when memory is returned to its proper place as history rather than enthroned as a sacred standard, a deeper space opens. Not radiant light, and not yet complete peace, but a dark chamber where all certainties dissolve, where the soul is compelled to pass through what alchemy calls nigredo. In the alchemical tradition that Jung devoted his life to deciphering nigredo is the darkest moment. All former forms collapse. Meaning decays. What was once revered begins to carry the odor of decomposition. Jung wrote, "In the course of the individuation process, the individual must expose himself to the conflict of opposites. There are no shortcuts. There is no way to positivize nigredo. It must be lived through. And yet, it is precisely here that alchemical knowledge begins to soothe. Because nigredo is not failure. It is a prerequisite. Without dissolution, there can be no albedo, the new clarity of the soul." Jung emphasized, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." The dark chamber is not where we remain trapped. It is where roots take hold. The distortion of the anima. When she becomes a vampire, a statue, or a romantic illusion, is not a personal flaw, but an inevitable phase of the process. Alchemy calls solve et coagula, dissolve and reform. Jung regarded this formula as a map of individuation itself. The alchemical process is a symbolic description of the individuation process. Before a new form can coagulate, all old structures must first dissolve. Within this dark chamber, there is an image both terrifying and profoundly healing, the sacred marriage, hieros gamos. Not the wedding of two people, but the meeting of two inner principles, masculine and feminine, consciousness and the unconscious, logos and eros. Jung wrote, The coniunctio oppositorum is the central symbol of the individuation process. Union does not arise from avoiding contradiction, but from enduring it long enough. Imagine this chamber not as a prison, but as a place of ritual, a silent rite where the old is mourned and the new has not yet found its name. In this space, the anima no longer needs to seduce or destroy. She waits. And this waiting itself is the antidote to the ego's impatience. Jung warned the ego cannot be the master in its own house. In the dark chamber, the ego learns to step back. Negredo is often accompanied by a sense of meaninglessness, melancholy, even despair. But alchemy tells us this is the sign that the process is underway. Depression is like a woman in black. Jung wrote not to condemn, but to remind us that darkness carries a message. When the message is heard, it no longer needs to shout. Gradually, within the blackness, small white points appear, fragile, almost imperceptible. This is albedo, beginning to kindle a clarity that is not naive, a light that does not glare. Not positivity, but a purity sufficient for reconnection. Jung said, "The psyche is a self-regulating system. When it is not forced, it finds its own path toward balance. And it is here that the sacred marriage begins to take form. There are no fireworks, no vows, only co-presence. The masculine releases, control the feminine releases. Manipulation. Consciousness stops imposing. The unconscious stops dragging downward. They meet in the dark chamber where neither stands above the other." Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Transformation occurs for both principles. This philosophy soothes because it restores meaning to every misalignment. Nothing has gone wrong in a way that lies outside the process. Every collapse is an act of solve. Every quiet moment carries the seed of coagula." Jung emphasized, "Man needs difficulties. They are necessary for health, not for endless endurance, but for depth of maturity. Allow the dark chamber to do its work. No need to shorten it. No need to brighten it prematurely. Tonight, simply remain. Breath steady. Heart slow. When resistance falls away, the ritual completes itself in its own rhythm. And then, union is no longer an idea, but a subtle, grounded feeling from this wedding in the dark chamber. One final thing awaits ahead, not a climax, but a rounded stillness. But before stepping into the light, allow the soul to rest a little longer in the chamber that has grown familiar. For what was once terrifying has now become a foundation. Part 10. The Dance of Kali. And when the wedding in the dark chamber has completed its silent rite, when the two opposing principles no longer struggle but stand beside one another in stillness, a new movement begins. Not a movement of will, but of dance. Consciousness no longer needs to understand anything further. It steps back like a spectator who knows this performance is not meant for thought, but for a deeper experience of the soul. Now allow your imagination to open to an ancient image, the dance of the goddess Kali. In the Eastern traditions that Jung held in deep respect, Kali is not the embodiment of evil, but the naked truth of transformation. She is both destroyer and creator, both terrifying and profoundly compassionate. Jung once wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." Kali is the living image of that paradox. Watch her dance. Each step is an ending of a cycle. Each turn is the beginning of something new. She wears a garland of fallen skulls, symbols of the ego's old structures that have died, yet her eyes do not judge. Those eyes know. Jung called this the wisdom of the unconscious. The unconscious knows more than the conscious. In Kali's gaze, destruction carries no resentment. It carries necessity. And in this moment, you realize you are no longer standing outside. You transform. No longer the one who endures. No longer the one who analyzes. You become a butterfly, delicate light, and perfectly attuned to the air. Jung wrote, "The symbol is the best possible expression for something unknown. The butterfly is not an explanation. It is a sign that the process has reached a stage beyond words." Feel the moment of shedding the cocoon of old romanticizations. The illusions once worshipped, once painful, once draining life force, no longer need to be condemned. They fall away on their own. Kali does not tear the cocoon apart. She dances, and the heat of the dance renders the cocoon unnecessary. Jung emphasized that deep change never comes through force. There is no change from darkness to light, or from inertia to movement without emotion. the butterfly circles the fire of transformation, not plunging into it, not fleeing from it, only moving close enough to feel its warmth. This is the most subtle point of this stage closeness without being consumed. Jung called this the capacity to hold opposites. The individuation process is a dialectical process, neither running from the fire nor identifying with it. Below the ashes of illusion, lie still. They no longer smell of smoke. They are no longer hot. Ash is not failure. Ash is material. Jung often spoke of the unconscious using what remains to shape what comes next. The psyche is a self-regulating system. From ash, the next living form will emerge, not according to the ego's plans, but according to the rhythm of the soul. The dance of Kali begins to slow, not because she is tired, but because the performance is complete. In that slowing, the butterfly finds a steady, even rhythm, the rhythm of a heart that no longer needs to defend itself. Jung wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries. Nothing is rejected in this dance. Everything is metabolized. Allow the image to dissolve. Do not hold it. Do not analyze it. When a symbol has completed its work, it withdraws. Symbols lose their efficacy when they are explained away. Kali does not need to remain. The butterfly does not need to keep flying. What remains is a lightness, as if a burden has been set down without any conscious decision. In the steady rhythm of the breath, you may notice that rebirth is not loud. It does not require proclamation. It happens quietly when the unconscious is allowed to complete its cycle of transformation. Jung wrote, "The soul has a natural tendency toward healing. That tendency is now moving freely. From the dance of Kali, we do not rise higher. We settle, for what remains is not a climax, but a state of dwelling. In the next part, there are no violent images, no rituals, only a full presence where sleep can gently close this journey in a natural way. Remain a little longer in this feeling of lightness. The night is still holding you, and the soul, having finished its dance, is seeking a very quiet place to rest." Part 11. The test tube of discernment. And when the dance of Kali has dissolved into stillness, when the butterfly has found its quiet place of rest, what remains is neither a new emotion nor another image. What remains is a very thin distance the distance between what is happening within and the one who is aware of it. It is precisely within this distance that the final philosophy unfolds, not loudly, not with promises, but with steadiness. Barbara Hanna. One of Jung's closest and most faithful students, emphasized a core skill of inner maturation, the capacity to observe a mood as a phenomenon rather than identifying oneself with it. She invited us to imagine a mood as a substance placed inside a test tube, not denied, not judged, simply placed where it can be seen. When this is done, a very Jungian kind of miracle occurs. The ego is no longer possessed. Carl Jung called the state of being possessed by emotion, participation, mystique, the unconscious fusion between the ego and powerful psychic forces. He warned affects are like storms. They rage, but they also pass. When a storm arises, the issue is not whether storms exist, but whether we are swept away by them. The test tube of discernment is where we set the storm down close enough to observe far enough not to be carried away. Now sense this moment. A mood arises, sadness, longing, anger, or emptiness. By old habit, we say, I am sad, I desire, I am hopeless. But Jungian philosophy invites a subtle shift. There is sadness present. The difference sounds small, yet its consequences are profound. Jung wrote, I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. When we are no longer, the emotion choice becomes possible. Barbara Hanna emphasized that this discernment does not make us walled or detached. On the contrary, it protects the soul from being torn apart by unconscious cycles of repetition. When a misaligned anima rises, when desire, romanticization, destruction, or melancholy attempts to seize control, we do not need to fight. We place it in the test tube. We observe its temperature, its color, its rhythm, and then we wait. Jung was very clear. What you resist persists. Discernment is not resistance. It is non-identification. When an emotion is no longer fueled by identification, it begins to change on its own. The psyche is a self-regulating system. The test tube does not interfere. It allows self-regulation to occur. Here we touch the masterpiece of individuation, not becoming stronger, not controlling emotions more effectively, but no longer being possessed. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Complete acceptance includes recognizing that these moods are not the totality of who we are. Recall the journey we have taken from the siren's lullaby to the altar of memory, from the dark chamber of Nigredo to the dance of Kali. Each symbol carried power until consciousness became steady enough to stand beside it without dissolving into it. The test tube of discernment is the final maturation, when the symbol has completed its work and we no longer need to be swept along. Jung wrote, "The ego is not the master in its own house." But he did not say the ego must disappear. He said it must find its proper place. The lucid observer does not dominate the unconscious. The observer enters into dialogue with it. And dialogue can only occur where there is distance. That distance is not cold, it is compassionate. If at this moment you feel a very simple sense of calm, that is a good sign. Not because every problem has been resolved, but because a burden has been set down. Moods come and go. The anima changes form, but the observer remains unhurried, unpossessed. Jung called this the formation of a new center. The self is the totality of the whole psyche, not an emotion, but the space that contains them. This final philosophy does not demand strenuous practice. It only asks for repeated awareness. Each time a mood arises, gently ask, who is observing this? The question does not require an answer. It creates distance. And within that distance, freedom begins to grow. From here, the journey can close without grand conclusions. Because when discernment is present, all other parts naturally return to their rightful places. In the final part, we will not learn anything new. We will simply rest in the understanding that the unconscious is no longer an enemy, and consciousness is no longer a warrior. The two have found a shared rhythm. Part 12. Dissolving into the ocean of Sophia. And when the test tube of discernment has been set down, when you no longer need to maintain distance in order to observe something very natural occurs, that distance too is no longer necessary. The observer does not disappear, but no longer stands apart. Consciousness does not dissolve, but it relaxes like a hand that has been clenched for too long, now knowing when to open. The ticking of the clock has now fallen silent, not because time has stopped, but because you no longer need to count it. There is no role left to perform, no image left to uphold. You are no longer a wife, a mother, a strong one, or a muse projected through another's gaze. All of those names, once necessary, once heavy, are now gently set down. You are simply a presence. In Jung's later thought, he often spoke of a principle deeper even than anima, and animus, the principle of Sophia living wisdom. Not analytical intelligence, but a wisdom that has passed through suffering and no longer resists it. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And when every projection has been withdrawn, what remains is not a new self, but a being that no longer needs to defend itself. Feel this moment as though you are dissolving into a single grain of golden dust, not small, not grand, just the right size to belong. A grain of Sophia drifting softly into the ocean of the collective unconscious, not sinking, not disappearing, simply merging. Here there is no longer right or wrong, no longer misalignment or healing. What was once distorted no longer needs to be corrected. It reshapes itself naturally when returned to the whole. Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature. It is also the source of the highest good. In this ocean, desire is not destroyed. It dissolves into compassion. Unconditional compassion, without demand, without lack, without the need to be returned. Let your body feel the support, not like the embrace of another person, but like the holding of life itself. The ocean of Sophia does not ask whether you were right or wrong. It does not require you to understand anything further. It simply receives. Here, Anima, now healed, is no longer an image. She does not guide, does not seduce, does not lull through illusion. She becomes a lullaby, the rhythm of wholeness, remembering itself. Jung once wrote, "Wholeness is not achieved by cutting off a portion of one's being, but by integration of the contraries." And now there is nothing left to integrate. The opposites have come to rest within one another. Your breath, slow, steady. Each exhale is a small wave spreading into the ocean. Each inhale is permission to remain. No need to try to sleep. No need to try to let go. Sleep arrives on its own, like a tide that needs no name. In this state, the ego does not vanish. It rests. Jung said, "The ego is not the master in its own house, and when it ceases to rule, the house grows quiet. If any images still drift by a memory, a face, a faint emotion, let them float like reflections on the surface of water. No holding, no pushing away. The ocean knows how to embrace without grasping. Sleep is coming, deep, like the depths of the ocean of Sophia. Gentle, like understanding without words. Safe, in the arms of the eternal feminine, the principle that is embracing, containing, and never abandoning. Sleep, well, woman of the late night. There is no journey that must continue right now. No question that needs answering. Only presence dissolving into itself. And in that dissolution, sleep closes the circle, very softly, very deeply, very completely.